Okay, so chapel where the services occur.
Oh, it's chapel, sanctuary, yeah,
Right.
various
Like,
different words.
that's my favorite part. That's
Why
not
would they put
fun.
all that money into, I mean, there's sort of a balance of money when you build a church. Let's say you have $5 million you're going to spend. How much are you going to spend on the place that you eat bad cookies after church? And how much are you going to spend on, now we're going to get into value, which is a whole nother conversation. How much are you going to spend on this room where everyone sits quietly and maybe the preacher talks and maybe there's music and maybe there's silence? Well, that's being the difference in the decor speaks to the value. And you might say, well, that seems rather undemocratic to put all that value in a room where you're not even talking to each other and eating. You're sort of quietly sitting there with your thoughts or engaging in an internal monologue with divinity or the universe or a god, you know. But the tell, you exactly picked up on the tell, even if they're not conscious of, well, of course we're going to spend a lot of money on those deep woods in the sanctuary, and we've just blown all our money on that room, and so it's white paint, sheetrock, and crappy cookies in the other room.
I'm not going to tell churches how they should run, but I think it would be nice if, like, especially, the whole thing, you go there once, maybe a couple times a week. It's nice if the whole experience feels religious. Like, I like the idea. I haven't thought about it a lot, that your environment actually tells you something about how important your activities are, or how important you are, or how sincerely to take what you're doing.
How much money do people spend on weddings? Why?
Too much. See, I go the other way there. I feel like,
yeah, exactly.
Well, anyway, I still think there something could be. Is it? Do you think it's purely a matter of money, or, like, I wasn't sure if it was a more modern
No. And
issue.
your point is real. But this gets into a lot of other deeper things, in that the organ and the stained glass and the dark woods and the burgundy in that one room facilitate something. And actually, if the church, when you're actually building a church, one of the, this stuff just gets so deep. So if you look at a big box evangelical church in a suburban area, you will probably find that their sanctuary is maybe called an auditorium and has painted sheetrock, and all of the money is in the stage lights, the sound equipment, the musical instruments, and now the video cameras. Why? Because that church is delivering, using, as John Vervaeke would call, a psychotechnology to afford a level of self-transcendence to the people sitting in the seats. And one would be not clueless to notice the similarities between that and a movie theater, as opposed to, let's say, a cathedral, where, here's the funny thing about old churches. Most old churches don't have that crappy room where you eat cheap cookies. They just have they just have the main room. And it was only later on that churches started adding the sheetrock room with the bad cookies.
That was
and yeah,
I mean, obviously, that's what they look like. They don't look like if they looked like an old simple room, that would be neat too. Like, if they had old blocks of stone and they were cold, that would be its own experience.
But often what was happening, but now let's pay more attention, because, well, so those buildings that just have the sanctuary, how could they get away with not having a fellowship hall? Well, because that church, when was that church built? That church was probably built before the 20th century. How did people get to church? They walked. Where did they live in relationship with the church? Just down the road. Who were they worshiping with? Everyone else who just lived down the road. What did they do after church? Went back into each other's homes and did that fellowship thing in the homes. In other words, that fellowship room on the side of the church is actually an extension of the home, not the church, because the church building is functioning within a larger ecosystem. You only start seeing fellowship halls happen once people have to drive to church or take public transportation to church. Because what do you do after church? Well, you talk to the other people who are the church. Where are you going to talk to them? You're not going back to the house, which is just across the street. You want a place to stop and stay. I guess we got to build a room for that because we don't want to stand in the rain. And that's where the fellowship hall developed. And that's why it looks like it does, as opposed to the church. And what about the crappy cookies? Well, it used to be we would come home and everyone would go to the patriarch or the matriarch's home, and there would be all of the food and everything in the pantry and be like going to Bilbo Baggins' Hobbit hole. And there would be hospitality. But now we need cookies for a few hundred people. Well, how are we going to get cookies for a few hundred people? We're living in an industrialized place. And so we go to the bakery industry and we buy them. You see, all of this stuff has all of these layers. But when we walk in the 20th century, we don't think about the fact that, why is it that any church built before 1900 doesn't have a parking lot? Well, because there weren't any cars. Well, how did they get here? Well, they walked. Well, how did that change the relationship between the church building and the neighborhood and the community compared to in the 1950s? There was a church growth guy that was writing books saying, if you want your church to grow, you need to build a parking lot. And so what churches did was buy the buildings next door, tear them down so they could have a parking lot so people would drive to church. But then they built the additional buildings onto the church because you weren't going back home right afterwards. You were staying right there with the people. But all of this stuff is built into all of the rest of the world around us. But we don't see it because we've only been alive for a few decades.
Mm-hmm.
So there's lots going on. But we can't manage all of that lots because we don't have enough time in our lives. So, gosh, we just finished singing together and having the Lord's Supper and calling each other brother and sister. I just want to have a conversation with you, but I don't want to stand in the snow. Well, let's build this room over here. All right. Well, how much money do we have left for that? Well, it took centuries to put this other building up. We need to build this one like next year. Bang. There it looks. But now you're going to have a tradition. It just goes on and on.
Wonder if you could have a business that redecorated those rooms.
Oh, trust me. Churches work on this stuff all the time. So when the seeker movement came through, which took out all of the wood and the paneling and the stained glass and had made the sanctuary look like a junior college auditorium, because in the 1980s, people who were raised in the 50s got all nervous around stained glass. So they made the auditorium look like an auditorium. And then they said, and you know what? The stuff that you eat at church is horrible. The coffee comes out of this big urn. The snacks are horrible. And so guess what? If you look at a church built in about 1990, you're going to find a fairly plain auditorium in certain traditions. And then you're going to find, we've got comfy chairs. We've got a fireplace. We've got Starbucks coffee. We've got stuff from the best bakery in town. And the place where you're doing worship looks like an auditorium, but you're putting all your money into electric guitars and drums and musicians to get that transcendent experience in your brain. And then afterwards, you're going into this place that looks like a living room. Did you ever think of what funeral halls are? Funeral halls also, funeral parlors, they have an auditorium and then it looks like a living room. It kind of looks like grandma's living room. Well, that's because 80 years ago, that all was happening in the home too. But the house didn't have a parking lot. People got a little creeped out when grandpa was lying in the front hallway overnight. I know plenty of people that can tell me that story. So all of this stuff just continues to go. But no, you're right, because people come along and say, "What? I kind of hate this room. Why can't we have a fireplace and some chairs and sofas?" And so now I also know a church in Tucson, Arizona, whose sanctuary is sofas and easy chairs, and their sanctuary looks like a living room. All of this stuff has meaning, and we're mostly doing it without a lot of theological reflection, but it's happening in churches all the time.
Hmm. That's interesting that they experiment so much with that. It feels to me like it's an important part of it, and I'd be wary of making anything too stark or too modern, um, because
Well,
part of
the the funny thing was, so in the 1980s, those who were built in the 60s that got all claustrophobic about stained glass and churchiness, then suddenly had music that sounded like jazz band and light rock and pop music in church. And then their kids came along and said, "This isn't like church. I want a cathedral and I want liturgy." And it's just, you're just going through this generational churning. And
right.
so churches and pastors actually study and watch this stuff all the time. And so then we look at you and say, "Oh, you know what kind of church this guy would be?" Just by, I don't know what your age is, but just looking at you, I sort of guess it. You're the kind of guy who wants the wood and the liturgy. You want it to feel religious, because otherwise, what's the point of going to church?
Hmm.
And so church plants that we started in the 1990s had guitars and rock bands and skits and, you know, places that looked like auditoriums. Churches we started in the 2000s and 2010s, weekly liturgy, remember your baptism, weekly communion, still have to have good music, still have to have good coffee, but you want the feels, you want the religious feels, because hey, if I want a show, I'll go to the theater. That's what's going on.